My co-author, R.P. Eddy, and I noticed what we thought was a pattern, that every time there was some great disaster or catastrophe, there was usually an investigation after the fact, what went wrong. And that investigation almost always revealed that there was some person before the disaster occurred who said it was going to occur. They were an expert, but the other experts disagreed. And we wondered, is this a phenomenon that occurs with some regularity? Because if there are people who can see disasters coming before the rest of us, if we could find them before the disaster, that would be enormously valuable. If we could find them and listen to them and pay attention, people who saw a specific thing coming, people who had what we call sentinel intelligence, the ability to see something over the hill before other people see it, who are predicting things that might happen in the future. That had never happened. This is one of the things we find over and over again, are rejected because they're predicting things that had never happened before. We call it first occurrence syndrome, and therefore implicitly thought he's exaggerating. He's being hyperbolic. This can't possibly happen. Why? Because it had never happened before. Now we know that throughout history, things happen for the first time. Things that have never happened before are what we study in history. In the old days, we remember dates of significance that had never happened before. So decision makers ought to know that just because something hasn't happened before doesn't mean it won't. They think they have good justification for ignoring a prediction if it's a prediction of an initial occurrence syndrome. And then there's the problem of all the other experts. And in the amount of time it took for everybody to catch up, it was too late. The same phenomenon, ISIS, a nation state, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the case of Fukushima in Japan. But yet, before those, there was someone, and that person was ignored. So we found in many, many cases, said the same thing. They said, I don't want this to happen. I don't want to be accurate. I want to be proven wrong. Here is my data. Tell me what's wrong with my data. And no one could. Having derived what we think are the lessons learned, we then looked at people today who were predicting things and being ignored. And we looked at issues first, and then tried to see if there was someone warning about it. Are people who are not directly involved in the thing that they worry about. There are people who observe it, and there are people who study it. One of the things we saw, it wasn't always clear that there was a decision maker. People always pointed at each other, saying that's your job, or at least it's not my job. It's not all clear whose job that is. To propose that we agree now as a planet, as a number of different countries and societies, to put limits on the development, and to do that by international treaty, and to have observation to make sure that it doesn't break out of predetermined limits agreed by human beings and their governments. So whether it's the possibility of an asteroid hitting the Earth, or human beings being genetically engineered, or artificial intelligence taking over, that they need to be listened to. And there needs to be examination of the theories that they're putting forward and the data that they're putting forward, even if they are an outlier, a minority view among experts. We think the solution here to predicting the future is finding people who can do it. Something pops right out at them. They see, through pattern recognition, in a flash, they see the problem that other experts in the field just don't see or don't understand. So sometimes they see it first, and later people come along and agree with them. But they see it so clearly, and it is the belief in their own analysis, in their own data, is so strong that they feel they must do something about it. They all feel a personal sense of agency, of responsibility. They have to give the warning. And when they are not heeded, when they are ignored, when they are ridiculed, when in some cases they are muzzled or fired, that creates a negative feedback loop because they become more strident, more insistent on getting their message out. Sometimes that's off-putting. Sometimes they are accused of being obstreperous or obsessive. Words like doom and gloom and all sorts of criticisms are leveled on them. And what we found, one of the problems with these issues is that frequently there is not a decision maker, or it's a diffuse decision-making process. It's not clear who can pull the trigger, who can respond to the warning. Another characteristic of the decision maker is frequently that they have an agenda of their own. They have a position of responsibility. President of the United States, president of the university, CEO of the corporation. They assumed that job with something in mind. They were going to do X, Y, and Z. Suddenly, somebody comes into the room and says, you can't do that. You can't do your agenda. You have to pay attention to my agenda. And oh, by the way, paying attention to my agenda is going to cause you to have to spend money in ways that you didn't want to spend it. It's going to make life inconvenient for people. Decision makers hearing that are very reluctant for the most part. Because they are so fixed on their agenda, they don't want to hear about something that would pull them off from that agenda. Decision makers also, in many of these cases, frankly, are not experts and not trained in any way to understand what the decision maker is saying. They didn't get it. Very frequently, the problem is decision makers don't understand, fundamentally don't understand the science or the math. If the issue is of such a magnitude that it would require enormous change, decision makers don't usually want to do that. If it's a complex issue, people don't understand it. If it's an issue that has never happened before, people find an excuse for not acting. And so sometimes it's the very fact of the issue itself that suggests nothing's going to happen. For example, when we ask people, what do you think about the risk of a giant asteroid hitting the Earth and destroying a city? People giggle. People laugh. The issue itself causes people not to take it seriously, in part because they've seen science fiction movies. The issue itself just seems so ridiculous to them. They've never seen it happen before. But it has happened before. It's happened a lot in the history of this planet. It just hasn't happened a lot in the history of this planet with human beings on it. Sometimes the critics are paid critics, as in the case of the tobacco industry in the United States, which bought experts to say that smoking was not a problem. So the question we ask is, what is the critic saying? For example, when the data is so clear that it meets the scientific method, it will be too late. We call that scientific reticence. Scientific reticence when scientists are reluctant to make a conclusion because the data is not there in the traditional way of experimentation. But when it is, it'll be too late.